Greece is celebrated for its philosophy, art, and democracy, but beneath the surface lay a harsh and often overlooked reality: slavery. Millions, from prisoners of war to those born into bondage, were condemned to brutal servitude. From the grueling mines where slaves worked until their final breath, to the fields and homes where they were treated as property, the suffering was immense. Join us as we uncover the harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece. The brutal reality, unveiling the dark underbelly of ancient Greek slavery. Imagine a world where your life, your freedom, and your very identity could be stripped away in an instant. This wasn't a dystopian nightmare, but the brutal reality for countless individuals in ancient Greece. Behind the gleaming marble of the Parthenon and the lofty ideals of democracy lurked a dark secret, a society built on the backs of slaves. Welcome to the hidden world of ancient Greek slavery, where human beings were reduced to mere property, and the line between freedom and bondage was terrifyingly thin. Slavery, an institution as old as civilization itself, was deeply entrenched in the Greek world, permeating every aspect of daily life, from the bustling streets of Athens to the rural estates of Sparta. For those unfortunate souls known as doulos, life was a relentless struggle, their autonomy stripped away as they were forced to serve the whims of their masters. The scale of slavery in ancient Greece was staggering. In Athens alone, it is estimated that slaves made up between 30 to 40% of the population during the classical period. These enslaved individuals were not merely a marginalized group. They were the very foundation upon which Greek society was built. From the silver mines of Laurium to the households of the elite, slaves toiled ceaselessly, their labor fueling the economy and enabling the leisure and intellectual pursuits of their masters. But the impact of slavery went far beyond economics. It shaped the very identity of the Greek people, creating a sharp divide between the free and the enslaved. To be a slave was to be stripped of one's humanity and reduced to the status of mere property. In the eyes of the Greeks, slaves were tools to be used and discarded at will, their lives and well-being of little consequence. This dehumanizing ideology permeated every aspect of Greek thought and culture, from philosophy to politics, casting a long shadow over the legacy of this ancient civilization. Shackled by Fate: The Paths to Enslavement in Ancient Greece. The pervasive nature of slavery in ancient Greece raises a chilling question. How did so many find themselves trapped in this cruel system? The paths to enslavement were as diverse as they were merciless, weaving a web that could ensnare anyone, from the mightiest warrior to the most innocent child. For many, the path began on the battlefield, where the clash of armies left countless prisoners of war in its wake. These unfortunate souls, ripped from their homes and families, found themselves thrust into a life of servitude, their fate sealed by the whims of their captors. But warfare was not the only route to enslavement. In a society where debt was a constant specter, many found themselves shackled by the chains of financial ruin. Creditors, armed with the power of the law, could seize not only the assets of their debtors, but also their very persons. Entire families could be torn apart and sold into slavery to satisfy the demands of their creditors. Piracy, too, played a sinister role in the slave trade of ancient Greece. Coastal communities lived in constant fear of raid and abduction as pirates descended upon unsuspecting villages like wolves among sheep. The young and able-bodied were particularly prized, and their strength and vitality made them valuable commodities in the slave markets of the Mediterranean. Even the most innocent and vulnerable were not spared from the brutal reality of slavery. Abandoned children, left to the mercy of fate, often found themselves sold into servitude, their lives forever altered by the cruelty of circumstance. This callous disregard for human life and dignity was a stark reminder of the harsh realities of ancient Greek society, where the line between freedom and bondage was often razor-thin. The dehumanizing justification: ancient Greek views on slavery. Beyond the clanking chains and crowded slave markets lay an invisible force that perpetuated slavery: the Greek mindset itself. Like an unseen current, It shaped the very foundations of their society, carrying with it a toxic justification for human bondage. In the eyes of the ancient Greeks, slavery was not merely a necessary evil, it was a fundamental aspect of the natural order. To the Greek mind, the world was divided into two distinct categories: the civilized and the barbaric. The Greeks, with their advanced culture and sophisticated political systems, saw themselves as the epitome of civilization, while all others were relegated to the status of barbarians. This ideological framework served as a powerful justification for the institution of slavery. The Greeks believed that some individuals were inherently inferior, destined by nature to serve their superiors. Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers of the ancient world, argued in his Politics that slaves were living tools, their very existence tied to the will of their masters. This dehumanizing ideology permeated every aspect of Greek society. Slaves were not viewed as individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and desires, but as mere extensions of their master's will. They were treated as property, to be bought, sold, and disposed of at their owner's discretion. This brutal mindset was evident even in the language of slavery, where terms like andrapodon, meaning man-footed thing, were used to describe enslaved people. The justification of slavery through the lens of the natural hierarchy had far-reaching consequences. It allowed the Greeks to maintain a system of oppression and exploitation without any moral qualms. In their minds, slaves were not fully human and therefore did not deserve the same rights and considerations as free citizens. This twisted logic would have devastating effects on the lives of countless individuals, condemned to a life of servitude by the very society that claimed to embody the highest ideals of civilization. Toiling Under the Sun, the diverse labor of ancient Greek slaves. The Greek justification for slavery wasn't just a philosophical stance, it was a harsh reality embedded in daily life. From dawn until dusk, this ideology took shape in the exhausting labor of countless enslaved individuals. Under the relentless Mediterranean sun, they worked tirelessly, providing the foundation for the Greek economy. In fields and orchards, these enslaved workers plowed the earth and tended crops, their sweat and toil fueling the food that sustained their masters. The workshops of ancient Greece also included slave labor. Skilled artisans, their talents honed through years of forced apprenticeship, worked tirelessly to produce the goods that fueled the Greek economy. From delicate pottery to sturdy metalwork, the fruits of their labor were prized throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet even within the confines of the household, slaves found no respite. Domestic servants, often women and children, were tasked with the endless drudgery of cooking, cleaning, and tending to the needs of their masters. The wealthy elite, freed from the burdens of manual labor, relied on the constant service of their enslaved staff to maintain their lavish lifestyles. But not all slaves were consigned to a life of physical toil. Some, particularly those with specialized skills or education, found themselves in roles that required intellectual labor. Doctors, musicians, and even teachers could fetch high prices on the slave market, their value tied to the rarity of their expertise. Yet no matter how highly prized their skills might be, these slaves remained the property of their masters, their freedom forever out of reach. The sheer scale of slave labor in ancient Greece was staggering. In some city-states, slaves made up a significant portion of the population, their numbers rivaling or even exceeding those of free citizens. This reliance on enslaved labor would have far-reaching consequences for Greek society, shaping its economic, social, and political structures in ways that would reverberate throughout history. The unending nightmare, daily life as a slave in ancient Greece. The exploitation of slave labor was just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond the backbreaking work lay a world of relentless degradation and misery that permeated every aspect of a slave's life. For the slaves, life was an unending nightmare, a hellish existence marked by backbreaking labor, constant fear, and the unrelenting knowledge of their own powerlessness. From sunrise to sunset, they toiled under the watchful eyes of their masters and overseers, their every moment dictated by the whims of those who owned them. The living conditions of slaves were nothing short of wretched. Crammed into tiny, squalid quarters, they were denied even the most basic comforts. Families were routinely torn apart, with children ripped from their mothers' arms and sold to the highest bidder. Privacy was a luxury that slaves could scarcely imagine, their every action scrutinized and controlled. The daily grind of slave labor was a relentless onslaught of physical and emotional torment. In the fields, slaves worked from dawn until dusk, their backs bent under the scorching sun as they harvested crops and tilled the earth. In the mines, they toiled in darkness, their lungs choked with dust and their bodies battered by the unforgiving rock. The whip and the chain, punishment and control in ancient Greek slavery. The backbreaking labor and squalid living conditions were just the surface of slave suffering. Beneath this visible misery lurked an even more sinister reality, a world of calculated cruelty designed to break both body and spirit. For those who dared to defy their masters or were perceived to have slighted them in any way, the consequences were swift and merciless. The whip, a symbol of the master's absolute power, tore into the flesh of the disobedient, leaving behind a tapestry of scars that served as a constant reminder of their subjugation. But the whip was just one of the many tools in the arsenal of control wielded by the slave owners. Branding, a practice as old as slavery itself, marked the enslaved as property, their bodies forever scarred with the sigils of their masters. Confinement, too, was a common punishment, with slaves locked away in dark, cramped spaces for days or even weeks at a time, their minds and bodies slowly unraveling in the suffocating darkness. For those who dared to resist or rebel, the consequences were even more horrific. Torture, in all its myriad forms, was a favorite tool of the slave owners, designed to break the spirit and shatter the will of the enslaved. From the searing pain of hot irons to the agonizing stretch of the rack, the screams of the tortured echoed through the streets, a chilling reminder of the price of defiance. In the most extreme cases, the ultimate punishment awaited: execution. Crucifixion, a slow and agonizing death reserved for the most heinous of crimes, was a common fate for slaves who dared to raise their hand against their masters. The sight of their bodies broken and lifeless upon the cross served as a macabre warning to all who might dare to challenge the established order. But death was not the only fate that awaited those who defied their masters. Mutilation, the removal of limbs or other body parts, was a common punishment for slaves who were deemed too valuable to kill outright. These unfortunate souls were left to live out their lives in agony, their bodies forever bearing the marks of their master's cruelty. And for those who survived the lash and the brand, the specter of forced labor in dangerous conditions loomed large. In the mines and quarries of ancient Greece, slaves toiled in darkness and despair, their bodies pushed to the brink of collapse as they harvested the precious metals and stones that fueled the empire's economy. In the galleys of the Athenian navy, slaves rowed until their hands bled and their lungs burned, propelling the ships of war to glory or doom. The silent suffering, psychological impact of slavery in ancient Greece. The cruel punishments and backbreaking labor were but the visible tip of slavery's iceberg. Beneath the surface, a far more pervasive and lasting form of torment took root: the psychological devastation of a life in chains. For the slaves of Greece, the loss of autonomy and identity was a wound that never healed, a scar upon the psyche that endured long after the body had mended. To be a slave in ancient Greece was to exist in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. The knowledge that one's life and fate were held in the hands of another, subject to their whims and caprices, was a source of unrelenting anxiety. The enslaved lived each day with the knowledge that their master's mood or temper could mean the difference between a day of hard labor and a night of unimaginable torment. This loss of control over one's own destiny took a heavy toll on the minds of the enslaved. Depression, that dark and insidious beast, stalked the slave quarters of ancient Greece, its icy grip tightening around the hearts of those who had lost all hope. For many, the only escape from the unrelenting misery of their existence was through the release of death. a final act of defiance against the cruel hand of fate. But even in death, the enslaved were not free. The knowledge that their bodies would be disposed of like so much refuse, denied even the basic dignity of a proper burial, was a final, searing indignity. The souls of the enslaved were left to wander the underworld, forever seeking the peace and rest that had been denied them in life. Stripped of dignity, exploitation in ancient Greek slavery. While public punishments and backbreaking labor were visible signs of slavery, behind closed doors, a more personal form of torment awaited. The sexual exploitation of slaves laid bare the true depths of this institution's depravity. The bodies of the enslaved were not their own, but rather the property of their masters, to be used and abused as they saw fit. For the women of ancient Greece, the threat of sexual violence was an ever-present reality. Enslaved women were routinely subjected to the most degrading and dehumanizing of abuses, their bodies violated, and their dignity stripped away in service to their masters' twisted desires. Many were forced into a life of prostitution, their bodies sold to the highest bidder in the brothels and back alleys of the city. But it was not only the women who suffered under the yoke of sexual exploitation. Enslaved men, too, were subjected to the perverse whims of their masters. The ancient Greeks, with their rigid hierarchies of power and domination, saw the bodies of their slaves as little more than objects to be used for their own gratification. Men and boys were routinely subjected to molestation and other forms of sexual abuse, their cries of pain and shame echoing through the halls of their masters' homes. The scars left by these abuses were not just physical, but mental and emotional as well. The trauma of sexual violence left an indelible mark on the psyches of the enslaved, a wound that would never fully heal. Many were left broken and shattered, their sense of self and identity forever shattered by the brutality of their experiences. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. The harsh realities of slavery in ancient Greece were reflected in the minimal functional clothing slaves were given, which was determined by their roles and status. Practicality, not comfort or modesty, dictated their attire. Household slaves typically wore a short chiton, a simple tunic that extended from the shoulders to the mid-thigh or knee. Though made from rough materials like wool or linen, this garment at least provided some coverage to maintain appearances within their masters' homes. For those engaged in more physically demanding or outdoor work, such as agriculture, mining, or construction, clothing was often reduced to the bare minimum. Many laborers wore only loincloths, or in some cases, nothing at all. This nudity was especially common in hot weather to allow ease of movement and prevent damage to garments. In addition to their lack of clothing, many slaves were chained during their labor, further symbolizing their dehumanization. Complete nudity and the use of chains not only served practical purposes, but also underscored their reduced status. Stripped of both clothing and dignity, these slaves were forced to endure harsh conditions, particularly in tasks that required continuous physical exertion. The lack of modesty was not a choice, but a marker of their subjugation and the brutal realities they faced. What are your thoughts on this? Share your views in the comments below. The Galley Slaves, powering the ships of ancient Greece. From the land to the sea, the tentacles of Greek slavery reached every corner of society. The naval might of Athens hid a dark secret beneath its decks, a world of unimaginable suffering for those chained to the oars. In the galleys of the Athenian navy, the true cost of maritime supremacy was paid not in gold, but in human misery. These oars were pulled not by free men, but by the chained and shackled bodies of the condemned. These were the galley slaves, the forgotten heroes of the Peloponnesian War, whose sweat and blood fueled the engines of Greek conquest. Their anonymous toil formed the hidden foundation of Athens' naval dominance, their suffering obscured by the glory of military triumph. Life as a galley slave was a brutal and unforgiving existence. Chained to their oars, the slaves toiled in the bowels of the ship, their bodies battered by the unrelenting rhythm of the drum. The conditions were cramped and suffocating, with little room to move or breathe. The stench of sweat and desperation hung heavy in the air, a miasma of human misery that clung to the very walls of the ship. But the physical torment of the galley slaves was nothing compared to the psychological anguish that consumed their every waking moment. Many of these slaves were prisoners of war, ripped from their homes and families, and condemned to a life of servitude in the belly of a Greek warship. They lived each day with the knowledge that they were little more than expendable cogs in the machine of empire, their lives and deaths meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Disease and death stalked the galleys like twin specters, their bony fingers ever reaching for the weakest and most vulnerable among the slaves. Dysentery, scurvy, and other waterborne illnesses ravaged the close-quartered holds, leaving the slaves to writhe in agony as their bodies wasted away. Many did not survive their first voyage. Their bodies were tossed unceremoniously overboard to the waiting jaws of the sharks. Intellectual shackles, the plight of educated slaves in ancient Greece. Not all slaves toiled under the sun or roared the oars for the navy. Some walked the halls of learning, their minds as cultivated as any free citizens. Yet, their wisdom and talents only served to highlight the bitter contradictions of their enslaved status. These were the educated slaves, men, and women of learning and culture, whose intellects were prized even as their bodies remained in bondage. As teachers, tutors, scholars, and scribes, their knowledge and expertise were highly coveted by the elite of Greek society. But this veneer of respect masked a cruel irony. For all their erudition, they remained mere property in the eyes of the law. Many of these educated slaves came from the ranks of the conquered peoples of the Greek world. They were the spoils of war, the human chattel of the victorious armies of Athens and Sparta. Others were born into slavery, their talents and abilities recognized and nurtured by their masters from a young age. But regardless of their origins, all were bound by the same cruel fate, condemned to a life of servitude and subjugation. For the children of the Greek elite, the educated slave was a fixture of daily life. They were the patient teachers who guided their young charges through the intricacies of philosophy and mathematics, the stern tutors who drilled them in the art of rhetoric and oratory. They were the repositories of knowledge and wisdom, the living embodiments of the Greek ideal of the life of the mind. But even as they imparted their knowledge to the next generation of Greek leaders, these educated slaves were keenly aware of the limits of their own freedom. They may have been able to engage in the lofty discourse of philosophy and literature, but they were still bound by the strictures of their status as slaves. They could not own property, marry freely, or even choose their own fates. Their intellect may have been free, but their bodies and their lives were not. The Kos Uprising, a fight for freedom. The contradictions experienced by educated slaves sowed seeds of discontent throughout the Greek world. These seeds found fertile ground on the island of Kos, where in 412 BC, they erupted into a full-scale uprising. On this tiny speck of land in the vast expanse of the Greek Empire, the simmering frustrations of the enslaved population boiled over into open rebellion, their hearts aflame with the long-suppressed desire for freedom. The rebellion began in the dead of night, as the slaves, armed with makeshift weapons and fueled by a lifetime of rage and desperation, stormed the homes of their masters. The surprise was total. The slave owners were caught off guard by the sudden fury of the uprising. In the chaos that followed, the slaves managed to take control of large swaths of the island, their ranks swelling with each passing hour as word of the rebellion spread. For a brief shining moment, the slaves of Kos tasted the sweetness of freedom. They established their own government, electing leaders from among their own ranks to guide them in their struggle. They formed alliances with other groups of rebels and outcasts, their shared desperation forging bonds that transcended the boundaries of race and class. But the forces of the status quo, threatened by the specter of a world turned upside down, would not let the rebellion stand. The Athenian navy, alerted to the uprising by panicked slave owners, descended upon the island like a pack of hungry wolves. The fighting was brutal and bloody, The slaves were armed with little more than their own courage and determination against the might of the Athenian war machine. In the end, the rebellion was crushed, and the dreams of freedom shattered on the rocky shores of Chios. The leaders of the uprising were executed, their bodies left to rot in the sun as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the power of the slave owners. The surviving rebels were rounded up and sold back into slavery, their brief taste of liberty nothing more than a bitter memory. However, though the Chios rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, its impact would be felt for generations to come. The aftermath. Consequences of slave rebellions in ancient Greece. The Chios rebellion, though defeated, left an indelible mark on the psyche of Greek slaveholders. What followed was a dark chapter of heightened cruelty, as fear of insurrection reshaped the very foundations of slavery. Slave owners, trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and rage, could not shake the specter of rebellion from their minds. The mere thought of the oppressed rising up against their oppressors haunted their dreams and fueled their paranoia. In the smoldering aftermath of the uprising, they were determined to do whatever it took to ensure such a thing could never happen again. The consequences for the slaves who had dared to rebel were swift and brutal. Those who had not been killed in the fighting were subjected to the most horrific of punishments, their bodies broken on the rack and the wheel, their flesh seared with hot irons. The lucky ones were simply sold back into slavery, their brief taste of freedom reduced to nothing more than a distant, bitter memory. But the impact of the rebellion would be felt far beyond the confines of Chios. Across the Greek world, slave owners tightened their grip on their human property, their fear of another uprising driving them to new heights of cruelty and oppression. Laws were passed that made it even harder for slaves to gain their freedom, and the punishments for disobedience became even more severe. The specter of rebellion haunted the ruling classes, the fear of the oppressed rising up against their masters a constant shadow on their collective psyche. They became more vigilant and more paranoid, seeing the hand of rebellion in every act of defiance, no matter how small. The system of slavery, already a brutal and dehumanizing institution, became even more entrenched, the weight of its chains bearing down ever more heavily on the backs of the enslaved. The enduring legacy. Slavery's impact on ancient Greek society. As the dust settled on crushed rebellions, the true cost of slavery in Greek society came into sharp focus. The institution that fueled Greece's prosperity also corrupted its very soul. The institution of slavery, brutal and dehumanizing as it was, played a central role in the economy and society of ancient Greece. From the mines of Laurium to the fields of Attica, the labor of the enslaved fueled the engine of the Greek world, their sweat and blood, the oil that kept the gears of commerce turning. But the impact of slavery went far beyond the mere production of goods and services. It was a system that warped the very fabric of Greek society, creating a world in which the humanity of an entire class of people was denied. The enslaved were not seen as fully human, but rather as mere property, their lives and fates subject to the whims of their masters. This dehumanization had a profound impact on the psyche of both the enslaved and the enslavers. For the slaves, it meant a life of constant fear and degradation, their every waking moment haunted by the knowledge that they were nothing more than chattel, to be bought and sold like cattle. For the slave owners, it meant a society built on a foundation of cruelty and oppression, a world in which the suffering of others was seen as a necessary evil. The scars left by the institution of slavery on the Greek world were deep and enduring. The trauma inflicted on the enslaved would be passed down through the generations, a legacy of pain and suffering that would shape the course of history long after the last shackle had been broken. And for the enslavers, the system of slavery would corrupt their very souls, twisting their humanity into something dark and monstrous. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming darkness, there were glimmers of light. In the works of the great thinkers of the ancient world, from Aristotle to Plato, we can see the first stirrings of a moral awakening, a recognition of the fundamental injustice of the institution of slavery. Plato, in his Republic, imagined a utopian society where slavery was absent, hinting at a world beyond the cruel realities of his time. Aristotle, despite defending slavery as a natural institution, sowed seeds of doubt by acknowledging that some forms of slavery were unjust. These philosophical musings, though limited by the prejudices of their time, were the first cracks in the edifice of slavery's moral justification. But the roots of slavery ran deep, and its tendrils would continue to strangle societies for millennia to come. The Roman Empire, heir to Greek culture, would expand the institution to an industrial scale. The Atlantic slave trade would see millions torn from their homes, echoing the fate of those ancient Greek slaves. Even in the modern era, the specters of human trafficking and forced labor haunt our global society, grim reminders of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.